to Val and to Paul, Father Derek, and the cake-making ladies. And I'm not sure if there was any cake-making gentlemen, but anyway, thank you all the same for making this celebration possible. I would like to thank all of you that visited George at Valmont Castle. This meant a lot to him. For those that don't know me, I'm George's granddaughter, Jade. I adored George, and he I. We didn't like being apart. George was my greatest fan. He was my north, south, east, and west. If ever I was uncertain, he was my guide. He was my strength. He made me feel safe. We loved each other deeply. In fact, he used to call me his cherub. And for those of you who know me, you will appreciate that this is a very befitting description. If we feel sad today, we must think of one of George's favourite sayings, which was always said when there had been any upset. It's all part of growing up, love. I expect lots of you here will remember George for that dear smile that he had, especially when he could no longer communicate via speech. But I'd like to ask you a question. How many of you here have ever shaken hands with George? Or ladies, maybe held his hand when talking with him? If you have, then you will know how strong and sincere that handshake was. This was a true mirror of his personality. George was an extremely generous and kind man. He would give you anything, even if it meant going without himself. He would always give me the eye of the lamb chop, or the stranger the last pound in his pocket. If there were kids who had no money for an ice cream when the van came round, he would buy one for each one of them. If someone was waiting at the bus stop when we drove past, he would give them a lift, even if it meant going out of his way. If something needed fixing, you didn't need to ask. It would be done, even if it was at his own expense. Not only would George help people, but animals. In winter, he would spend hours frying bread in fat for the birds and collecting scraps for the foxes. Yes, he certainly was generous to a fault, and especially on my birthdays. In fact, one year, he took my dog Eddie to the vet. On his return, he proudly remarked, "I've had him castrated for your birthday, love." George was extremely artistic. He could build or make anything. He produced beautifully drawn plates for one of the Navy's first human biology texts. George was extremely intelligent and clever. He was fast-thinking and could always solve any problem. You could rely on him. He was a man of few words, though those words would be well chosen and some a situation. We fondly call these collections of memories classic George lines. I used to wear eyeliner to school. My French teacher was less than impressed and summoned George to a meeting. "George, have eyeliner on?" she said. George replied, "Yes, so have you." "Yes," she said, "I am her teacher." "Exactly," said George. However, he could also be most amusing, though he would not realise how funny he was. George was certainly eccentric, and I think it would be safe to say that both my mother and I follow in his footsteps. On Saturdays, he would dress in his gardening clothes, which would make a tramp look scruffy. He would go to Charlotte Street Market at closing time. My Nana and I would not walk with him because he looked so awful. But George insisted that due to his attire, they would not see him coming, meaning that he would not get ripped off for the price of the veg, much to my Nana's disgust. One morning, I sat at the breakfast table after putting on my makeup. George was sat at the other end, wearing identical makeup. "Any reason you have that on?" I said. "You look stupid." He answered, "Do I, love? I only look like you." Or indeed, a real favourite of mine was when the cat was eating its Whisker's cat food. I said, "That smells really nice, actually." When I opened my sandwich box at school that day, guess what? Whisker's sandwiches. It was not unusual for George to have various tasks in hand, and often components of machinery around the house and over the kitchen table. One day I sat at the table and George was complaining that the phone keypad was not working. together a large desktop calculator that he'd taken apart. "What's up with that?" I asked. "I've just told you, the phone keypad is not working." A slightly pained expression crossed his face as he glanced at the phone and then at the calculator keypad, realising that he had been dialing the phone on the calculator. "Twit!" he yelled. George wore glasses for a long time. He had been busy painting the garage door, using one of the garish colours that he had selected from the bargain basement of B&Q. Over the next few days after working hard, George complained that he had been seeing red dots and promptly went to the optician, who told him that in fact he had red paint on his glasses. "Twit!" he yelled. When we used to go to South Seafront, George would disappear off for a swim around the Nab Tower. This would clearly take hours. One day, he was just getting out of the water after swimming such a distance when a boy playing at the water's edge called over, "Want a hand, Grandad?" On another occasion, we asked, when he had returned from such a swim, "How was it?" "I saw a shark," he said, as basking sharks are common and rather large. "What did you do?" we said. "Swam back pretty sharpish," he replied as he sipped his cup of tea. I used to do cross-country running and was rather good. I was running for the south of England at the time, and George was my coach. One day, he ran with me. Towards the end of the 4-mile track, he sped off, bearing in mind that he was 70 plus at this point. He had disappeared into the distance. When I got to the finish line, he was lying there with his hands behind his head, where he told me, "You don't want to let an old man get the better of you, do you, love?" The game of snap was a favourite of ours. We would eventually end up rolling around laughing and saying "nap" to everything as we slapped the back of each other's hands, even if the cards were not actually snap. George would find it highly amusing to put plastic replica insects looking out from your cabbage on your dinner plate and wait for your horrified reaction as you went to delve into your food. On winter evenings, when the nights drew in early, I would be watching television. It would be dark outside, but the curtains still open. I may get up to go to the kitchen, only to be frightened out of my wits by George standing outside with a torch beneath his chin, pulling terrible contorted faces to frighten me. When we went on picnics, George liked to select a long blade of grass when you weren't looking. He would then proceed to tickle you around the neck, so as you would think it was a fly. After a while, you would look to check what was causing the irritation. There would be George pulling a "it's nothing to do with me" face. To wake you up in the mornings for school, George would sing a rousing chorus of hey ho, it's off to work we go, while swishing the curtains open and turning the light on and off. This clearly made you furious enough to get out of bed. George's grandmother was one of the first female missionaries in China, and his family history makes an interesting tale. However, he too has many gripping stories. Here is the one of the least ghastly that I can tell you. He was a young policeman walking the beat at night in Highgate, London. He often used to go down into one of the derelict tombs for a sleep, where his sergeant would not find him. He would extinguish his gas lamp and sleep. One night, he woke up, ready to return to base. He picked up his unlit lamp and walked up the steps of the mausoleum, only to be pushed backwards. He tried again, but the same thing happened. Lighting the lamp, he saw what was preventing his exit. A man had hung himself whilst George had been asleep in the tomb. He often recounted, however, that cold feeling when he realised he would have to explain to his sergeant how in fact he discovered the body. George was in Special Forces in the Navy, and I'm pleased to see some of you wearing your medals today. George was very proud of his, although I think they brought back memories of the horror and hardship of war and the friends that he had lost. He always felt at home talking with other servicemen. It has been said that all good men must die, but death cannot kill their names. A few years ago, we went to the Remembrance Day celebrations at the Royal Albert Hall, and which he very much enjoyed. His spirit was ignited, and he felt like he belonged. As a family, we would always go out on day trips, a couple of times a week, up until very recently. George loved to be out adventuring. We would have healthy discussions, torment each other, laugh and hold hands. George and I have always held hands, all my life, in times of happiness, times of sadness and times of quiet. And it is these strong, reassuring hands that I shall miss most deeply. He once said to me, after I'd been travelling, "Though we don't see each other much, we still miss each other." And Georgie, this is so true.